Today we are going to see how to create a sci-fi barrier. Hi guys, I'm Gabriel Aguiar, currently developing Rabbit's Tail, links below for more, and I'm gonna show you how you can create a simplified version of these barriers, from mesh to shader, and how to use it in VFX Graph. It may also interest you that I once recreated the barrier from Overwatch's character Reinhardt, and I left a link in the description in case you are interested. There's plenty of cool techniques to use it there. This entire project and many others are awaiting for you on my Patreon's page in case you wanna get your hands on it. I left some links below. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this. And a very important part of this effect is a mesh, a proper 3D object as this one, so we can apply our shader too. And to create this 3D object we are going to use Blender because it's free and it's easy to pick up. I am using Blender 3.1.2, and the first thing we can do is select everything with A and press delete so we can have a clean scene. From there we can press Shift A to add a plane. And press 7 in the numpad so we can go to the top orthographic view, and from here we can enter in edit mode by pressing tab because we want to add 5 segments to this with Ctrl R. You can scroll up or down to increase or decrease the segments. Once you have 5 you can press enter and then escape so they stay in the right position. And we are going to create a round barrier, at least the corners, and for that we can select the 4 vertices by holding shift and by pressing Shift Ctrl B. From here you can move to the sides and then scroll up or down to increase the smoothness of this curve. It will add more vertices, as you can see. Once you have this aspect, you can press B to select this right side of the mesh, and by pressing G and then X you can lock it in the X-axis and move it a value of 0.8. And do the same on the left side. Select with B, move with G, lock it in the X-axis by pressing X, value of -0.8. Great! It started to look like something. Now we just need to add another segment right here with Ctrl R, enter and escape so it stays in the right position, and do the same on the right side. Fantastic! Now let's get out of the top orthographic view, and if we select these 2 vertices and press G to move and lock it in the Z-axis, as you can see, we only moved these 2 vertices. So let's press escape. What we need is proportional editing. You can press O for the shortcut or go up here. And once you press G and then lock it in the Z-axis, as you can see, you can scroll up or down to increase the influence. But if you look closely, it is moving in a very strange arc. We can switch it up here and say we want sphere. Then it's only a matter of increasing or decreasing the influence and pushing up in the Z-axis to create this arced barrier, and here we go, looking good. If you want this to be smooth, you can press spacebar and search for Shade Smooth, or you can go up here to Object and select Shade Smooth. Let's rename this object. I'm gonna call it the Barrier Tutorial. Now, this is basically a piece of paper. Let's add some thickness to this. We can go to modifiers, and by selecting solidify, we can increase or decrease the thickness. I'm gonna set it to a value of 0.04, so it has a little bit of thickness, as you can see. And there's another cool trick we can do, which is adding a bevel modifier, so we can have some very smooth edges around our barrier. Here we go, looking very good. That's pretty much it. I'm gonna drag a new window now to take care of the UV maps. Up here I'm gonna select UV maps and then enter in edit mode, select all of the vertices with A, and as you can see this will distort the texture that we will apply to this. Fortunately it's super simple in this specific case to create the UV maps. We can go to the top orthographic view by pressing 7 in the numpad, and then with the U key you can select project from view bounds. And here we go, we have some pretty decent UV maps for this object, and it was super quick. So that's it, our barrier is ready to export in File, FBX. Make sure to turn on Selected Objects, and in my case I'm going to export this directly to my project, to the Models folder. I'm going to rename this to Barrier Tutorial once again, and export. Back to Unity now, we already have the mesh, so we can drag it to our scene. Let me just place it in the right position, and from now on we are ready to work on the shader. With right click, let's create a shader graph. You can either start with an unlit shader graph or start with a blank shader graph. I'm gonna go with blank shader graph. Rename this to barrier shader underscore dots. I will explain it in a moment. Underscore tutorial. Double click to open this up, and in the graph inspector, since we have selected a blank shader graph, we need to say the target. In this case, it's going to be for the universal render pipeline, which is the one I'm using. And I'm gonna say the material is unlit, which is not influenced by lights. I don't think this barrier needs to be influenced by lights, but if you think it does need, then make sure it's lit. I'm gonna turn on Allow Material Override so we can control all of these parameters directly in the inspector without opening the shader. And I'm gonna switch this to Transparent and say the blending mode is Alpha for now, but we will switch it to Additive. Right, so a very important part of this comes from a very small sample that Unity created. You need to go to the Package Manager, and in Unity Registry, in Shader Graph, you have here Samples drop-down menu. You want to install procedural patterns. They are extremely useful and so cool. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but I highly recommend it to, once you have downloaded it, to check out the notes to see how it works under the hood, because there is some really interesting stuff inside here. And once you have downloaded the procedural patterns, we can go back to our barrier shader, which is empty, and by pressing spacebar, we can search for dots. We want to use this one. You can try different patterns later on, but for now, the dots, super cool to play with. We can play with the size, the tiling. Those two values are going to be extremely useful, so let's create a float for the dot size and a vector2 property for the dot tiling, with a default value of 8 by 8, and for the dot size, default value of 0.8. Let's connect this to the proper inputs of the dots, and connect to the base color. Save the asset, save the shader, and create a material with right click from our shader. Drag and drop it to our mesh that we have in our scene, and as you can see, it's ugly. We just need to adjust the tiling of this. I found out that 25 in the X and 16 in the Y are good values. And we are going to use the additive blending mode, by the way. So that's a great start, as you can see. The dots are intense, they are continuous, as they should. But in our case, for the Sci-Fi Barrier, we want to break this pattern a little bit. We are going to multiply this with a simple noise, with a scale of 30. It's an interesting value to control in the inspector, so let's create a float. Dots noise scale, default value of 30, connect it down here, and connect it to multiply. Replace the connection to the base color. Save this, and as you can see, we have broken the pattern a little bit, at least the intensity of the dots. So let's create a group from this, right click, dots pattern. This is the dots pattern. We are going now to add something to this, and that something is going to be a gradient noise. Scrolling gradient noise. Let's create a float, a property for this, a noise scale, default value of 10. It's useful to control in the inspector. And if we want to scroll this through time, we are going to need a tiling and offset node. It will look awesome. So let's create one of these nodes. And as you can see, the offset will scroll up or down our texture. And to animate this through time, it's not that hard. We only need a time node, a multiply, and a vector2. We can create a property for the noise speed with a default value of 0.2 in the Y, and connect these both to the multiply and to the offset of the tiling and offset node. and here we go, it's scrolling. Before we add this to the dots pattern, we need to clamp the gradient noise, so the values don't go below 0 or above 1, so we don't have any strange artifact. And before we connect this to the base color, there's one thing we can do, which is add color to this. It will look awesome. So let's create a color property and call it the dots color. The color it's going to be in HDR mode, white and alpha at 100. Connect it here and replace up here the base color input, and we can group this and call it the noise. Once we save this, as you can see, we have some dots with a scrolling noise texture, procedural noise. Oh, and we can play with the color, by the way. For example, select a blue, like this one. It's starting to look like something, but it's a little bit too intense overall. So what we can do instead is create a mask for this. We don't want this to be so intense in the middle, for example. So up here, we can start with a polar coordinates node. It outputs two values, x and y, or r and g, and the r, if we connect to a power node, it's a black dot. We can control the size, the radius, with the b value. I'm gonna leave it at 3.7 for now, and if we multiply this with what we already have before the dots color, and then save it, as you can see now, this is starting to look like a barrier sci-fi shield, something of that kind. Very good looking. We can create another group, call it mask for example, and there's a very important value here, which is the mask power. We can create a float, default value of 4 more or less. And if we save this, now in this vector, you have control over the mask power, as you can see, which is quite useful. Now another thing we can do is add a border to this, highlight the edges, just like this. And the quickest way I've found to do it is to use a texture. For example, if you go back to Blender, enter in edit mode, select all of the vertices with A, up here in the UV window, in this UV drop down menu we can export UV layout. Make sure it's 2048 by 2048, export as a PNG, and then I'm going to use Krita for this part. I'm going to drag and drop the exported UVs, create a new layer, select a white color for this. I'm going to use this brush, by the way, with these settings. And then with the polyline tool, make sure you have the tool option. And if you don't see it, you can go to settings and in Dockers, you can turn it on down here. Make sure the fill is not filled and the outline is brush. Oh, and for the brush size, 80 pixels should be enough, by the way. It depends on how thick you want the outline of your barrier to be. Now it's all a matter of clicking one time and then creating the contour of this line. We are going to pass on top of it, everywhere, all of the corners, just like this, until we close it. And once we close it, we will have this white border. And you can hide the background, and if you want, with right click on the new layer, you can turn on outer glow and add even more glow. That's really up to you. I'm gonna leave it as it is without outer glow and export this without the background as a PNG to my project, to the textures folder. If you want, you can turn on alpha is transparency in Unity. Now, how do we use this? Well, it's not that hard. Let's create a texture 2D for the border texture and a color for the border color. I'm going to push both up here. The color it's going to be in HDR mode, white and alpha at 100. First we need to sample the texture. And then we only need to multiply this with the border color. And that's it. We are going now to create a group, for example, call it border. What's important is that we add this after the dot color. And then connect this to the base color. That's really important in this order specifically. Let me just rearrange this so you can have a better understanding of how this is connected. And once you save this, it will become white because the material that we have applied to our barrier doesn't have the border texture. So let's select our barrier, assign the border texture, and now we can select any color we want. I'm gonna go ahead and choose an orange color. And look how awesome it is. Now this is a Sci-Fi Barrier. By the way, I have a global volume with bloom, just so you know. And in case you are wondering, I can quickly show you how to use this with VFX Graph. Just make sure that in Package Manager you have Visual Effect Graph installed, and that in Edit and Preference in Visual Effects you have Experimental Operators / Blocks turned on, and then with right click you can create a Visual Effect Graph in a folder and drag and drop it to the scene after you have renamed it. All we gotta do is press the Edit button to open VFX Graph, and from here now, as you can see, we are outputting a quad, and in our case we want to output a mesh. So if you drag a line from here, you can search for mesh. You can choose if you want this to be illuminated or not. I'm gonna choose the lit version because it has a very cool feature, by the way, where you can cast shadows, among many other things. You can delete the quad output, and as you can see we have a bunch of capsules. In our case we only want one mesh at a time, so up here we don't want a constant spawn rate, we want a burst with only one particle. We also don't want this to move, so let's delete set velocity, and the lifetime is going to be constant. You can turn off randomness, for example like 5 seconds. This is where you decide how much time the shield will be up. And then down here, as you can see, we can assign our barrier. We cannot see it because it's probably very small, so let's use the set size to increase the size to 100. And now we can push the VFX Graph up so we can see the whole thing. And from here it's actually very simple. All we gotta do now is assign the shader we created. You probably won't see it because in the shader graph you need to tell this shader to use VFX Graph, to support VFX Graph in the graph inspector. Once you turn it on and save it, if you go back to VFX Graph, now you can find the shader you created. And from here it's a matter of copying the values you used for the mesh, basically the values of the material, which is what I'm doing right now. Once you copied the values, now you can do a bunch of things. Oh, it's probably black in the center because this output mesh is in alpha mode, but also because we didn't connect anything to the alpha input. It's very simple. At the end, the last node, you can split it and use the A channel, which is the alpha channel, and connect it to the alpha input of the fragment function. Save the shader, and here you go. You no longer have the black values in the center. Now it's a matter of doing whatever you want. For example, a very usual thing we would see is the barrier growing. You can use a set size over life, for example, and we must set the composition to multiply instead of overwrite any previous value. And in this curve now you can control the motion, the scale. For example, you can use the line, with right click add a few keys and create something similar to this where it bounces a little bit in the beginning and towards the end it will shrink. Cool, right? You can do many more things. I suggest you check out my channel where you will have plenty of tutorials about VFX Graph. You could as well fade this in, fade this out, and many other things. So that's it. Now you know how to create a barrier, how to create the mesh for the barrier, the shader, and how to use it in VFX Graph. This whole project is available on my Patreon's page. Any support is very much appreciated, guys. And I want to say thank you to each patron that supported in the last month. And a quick shout out to the top tier patrons, which are 3D Sorcery, Alpera Arichai, Achilles Benitez, Avia Tobali, Aya Pranayanda, Ruby Dubidu, Diego Marcos, Duke Williams, Duitron, El Sharif, Federico, Gilles Walter, Goblin Plague, Guilherme Trindade, Casey Miller, Kenan Ansel, Mark Anum, Mateus Bragança, Michael Gann, Mograph Tech, Mikola Piatko, Nat Sims, Oitsk, Pradip Sen, Quentin Journeau, Radioactive Bullfrog, Revenant Games, Vel, Verisuta, Victor Roman, Will Hughes, Will Poilion, Champion Ling, Myung Lakson, and Ingu Das. Thank you all very much for your support, it's super much appreciated. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and to anyone watch this, I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks, bye!